It was still beating. I could hear it thumping in his mouth as he chewed, blood dripping down his chin. I knew then that I would never leave the palace alive. It started when the prince came to our village, a place forgotten by the empire. We were used to being ignored, left to our own small lives. But that all changed when he arrived. He was different from any nobleman we'd ever seen. Not just in the way he dressed, in silks and jewels, but in the way he looked at people like they were livestock. At first, he acted polite, smiling and giving out gifts, but there was something dark beneath that smile. You could feel it if you looked into his eyes for too long, a coldness that made your skin crawl. No one dared speak ill of him, though. After all, he was the emperor's son, and his power was absolute. Then the disappearances began. It was subtle at first, a child here, an old man there. People whispered that it was bad luck, that they had wandered into the forest and been taken by spirits. But then whole families began to vanish. No screams, no signs of struggle, just gone, like they'd never existed. One night, the prince sent word that he was hosting a feast at the palace, inviting the villagers to attend. It was a grand gesture, and despite our fears, most of us went. The palace was huge and cold, with walls that seemed to swallow the light. Long tables were laid out with food, more than we'd ever seen in our lives, meats, fruits, delicacies we couldn't name. But no one dared to eat. Not until the prince had arrived. When he finally entered, there was a hush. He was dressed in black, his eyes darker than I remembered. He welcomed us with that same unsettling smile, but there was something else in his eyes, a hunger. As the feast began, the prince spoke of traditions, old customs that had been forgotten. He said the village was sacred, that the blood of its people was special. We were chosen, he said, to be part of something greater. I didn't understand what he meant until the servants started bringing out the real feast. They laid them on the table's bodies, pale and lifeless. I recognized some of them villagers who had disappeared. The prince stood at the head of the table, a knife in his hand. He spoke softly, but his words echoed through the hall.
Sacrifice is the oldest form of loyalty.
Then he cut into the chest of the man in front of him, reached in, and pulled out the heart. It was still beating. The prince lifted it to his mouth and bit into it, blood running down his chin. I couldn't move. None of us could. We were trapped, forced to watch as he devoured the heart. The room was filled with the sound of chewing, of bones cracking. The others, the ones who had been invited, were taken one by one. I don't know why he spared me. Maybe it was because I was young, or maybe he wanted me to spread the word, to make sure everyone knew what he was capable of. I remember trying to run, but the guards caught me. They dragged me back to the chamber, to the prince. He looked at me, his eyes shining with something inhuman. He told me that I would serve him now, that I belonged to him. For days, they kept me in the palace. I was given food, water, everything I needed. But every night, I heard the screams. Every night, I heard the prince feeding. Finally, one day, I managed to escape. I don't know how. Maybe they let me go. Maybe I was just lucky. I ran through the forest, back to the village, but when I got there, it was empty. The houses were abandoned, the fields overgrown. There was no sign of life, as if everyone had vanished into thin air. Now, I live alone, far from the palace, far from anyone. But I can't forget what I saw. I can't forget the sound of that heart, still beating in his mouth. And I know, deep down, that the prince is still out there, somewhere. Waiting. Watching. And one day, he'll come for me again.